Good evening, everyone. Late Night Mega here, and tonight we're playing a deck that I call Tokens or Bust. So strap yourselves in, because this is going to be a weird deck, as you can tell by glancing at the deck list. So the first card I want to talk about is Secure the Waste. Now, I've been a fan of this card ever since it was released, and I've always felt that instant speed token production is a very powerful effect and very underrated as well. So when I first saw this card spoiled for Dragons of Tarkir, I was like, oh my gosh, this is going to be like a $10 to $15 card. And it was sitting around $2.50 to a buck for most of the time until just recently in Standard, people have finally caught on and realized that this is a powerful effect. But I've been playing this pretty much from right out of the gate. And I had a Standard deck that I called Soldier Super Friends, one of the decks I'm known for at my local game store. The deck rotated when Theros rotated, and I was very sad. The deck basically played 4 Raise the Alarm, 3 Secure the Waste. The deck was built around Secure the Waste. The main idea was to go, okay, my board is empty, end of my opponent's turn, I secure the waste for as much as I can, untap, drop something like a Sorin Solemn Visitor, plus him up, swing for a bunch of damage, gain a bunch of life, and just have like an instant 1 to 2 turn clock out of nowhere, basically. And the deck was a huge success. I called it Soldier Super Friends because it basically either spammed tokens or spammed planeswalkers, and eventually one of those strategies worked. The deck ran 2 Ashiok, 2 Narset Transcendent, 3 Sorin, and 2 Elspeth Sun's Champion, and 3 of the Flip Jace. And then it was a control deck at heart. It basically controlled the combat step, being able to produce instant speed tokens. I had a couple Devouring Lights in there, so I could exile your guys even if I was tapped out because of the Convoke on Devouring Light. And I had a couple Dictative Heliod's, which could pump my whole team. And so it just made every combat step a nightmare, because my opponent never knew what they were walking into. Also with the Dictative Heliod, it also enabled the deck to get turn 5 kills, which is really weird to think about. A standard control deck getting a turn 5 kill is kind of crazy. Like I said, the deck was a huge hit for me, and naturally when it rotated I was really sad, and I also wanted to port this concept to Modern. However, dropping a Sorin into play after Secure the Waste and creating a 2-turn clock, some decks kind of don't care about that. You know, you tap out on your turn for a Planeswalker, and they're like, okay, well, you got me down, but I'm a combo deck, and now you're tapped out, you can't counter my combo. There it is. Or it's Tron, and they're like, oh, you played that? Well, here's an Ugin. And so trying to port this deck to Modern, it took me a couple months of brainstorming, really trying to get something that worked. And so I was sitting down and I was racking my brain. I'm like, okay, I play a control game for the whole time, and then at the end of my opponent's turn, when the board is clear or mostly clear, I go, end of your turn, secure the waste for a bunch, untap, and what do I do? What effect do I want? Clearly a Planeswalker alone, not quite enough, not quite going to be enough for the Modern format. But then it hit me. Since it's a Modern format, let's ramp up the power of the effect that I follow up with this 1-2 punch with Secure the Waste. So I secure the waste, untap, and I want to destroy all lands. And I'm like, okay, I don't even care if this is a sorcery, because I plan on playing it on my turn. What card could I have in Modern that can destroy all lands? I'll even pay 6 mana for it. So I did a search, and I came across this card, Boom and Bust. And sure enough, for 6 mana, sorcery, destroy all lands. And I'm like, that's perfect. So the main idea with this is to set up a board state where you have some tokens in play, and you blow up all the lands, and then after blowing up all the lands, you're pretty much set to win the game over the next several turns with the tokens you get. Now, sometimes I might be playing Bust when I only have, 3 to 5 tokens, and it might take, 3 or 4 turns. I'm kind of counting on my opponent not being able to recover very well from that sort of thing, and most of the time they don't. I don't think I've lost a game yet where I had a Bust resolve and the deck's theme came together. So, what other cards could go in this deck? Well, we've got the remands for some stall. We've got Think Twice for some draw. We've got Sphinx's Revelation also for some draw. Kind of weird to think about playing that when you're also planning on blowing up all the lands, but it works in a weird way. This whole deck is weird. If you're the type of person that wants to play a deck that makes your opponent's head spin and attracts a lot of attention from all the players at your local game shop, this is the deck to play. This is probably the most talked about modern deck that I have, and I have not played this deck since January. And as of the recording of this video, it's now mid-August, and people are still talking about this deck, or people that know this deck. So, another card that's synergistic with this, I mentioned in the previous video, is Mana Tithe. Mana Tithe, Path to Exile, and Boom and Bust. These three cards have really weird synergy together, but it works very well. So Mana Tithe, I will typically use this on the first thing that I get the chance to use. I want my opponent to know I'm playing Mana Tithe, and that's going to do a few things. If your opponent has no idea what this deck is, which first time you play it against them, I guarantee they won't have a clue what you're doing. Because they're going to see Mana Tithe, they're going to see Raise the Alarm, they're going to see Coalition Relic, they're going to be like, what in the world is all this? So you're going to play Path to Exile. It's going to thin lands out of their deck, so that when you blow up all the lands, hey, suddenly they have less lands to draw from left in their deck. Good thing they elected to search for that. And also, once you blow up all of the lands, guess what counterspell becomes relevant again? Mana Tithe. So yeah, synergy abound in this. And really weird as well. The ways I've seen my opponents play against these three cards is it's always really amusing. Like, people that know this deck and know what it's doing, I've seen them try and withhold lands back in their hand to playing around the Bust half of this deck, and when they do that, well, Mana Tithe tends to be relevant the whole game. Mana Tithe also has some interesting synergy with Remand, in the sense that, you get to the mid-game and Remand doesn't seem as good against, like, 2-mana cards. Your opponent has 4 lands, so, I mean, you remand it, but they have the mana to recast the card, so naturally they cast the card again right away. But then you Mana Tithe it the second time they try to cast it, so there's really interesting synergies with this deck. I've also seen people elect not to search with Path to Exile, even in the early game, because they know that I'm planning on blowing up all the lands. And sometimes I don't even blow up all the lands, because there's no part of this card text here that says destroy all lands that you're required to cast or resolve before winning a game. So there's games where I don't even do that. And there are some X spells in this deck, and the X spells do kind of want you to drop more lands into play. So typically, I typically don't want to play more than 6 lands, and I'm very cautious about dropping the 7th land into play, because I do want to play Bust. Ideally, you want to play Bust before you make your land drop, and so that way you can start rebuilding right away. And so typically I'll hold off on my 7th land drop, and if I've made my 8th land drop, I've pretty much committed to not casting Bust for that game. But that's okay, because we run a Desolate Lighthouse, so we can discard that for something else and filter through that. Same with Mana Tithe, because that can also become dead. I've also seen people play around the Mana Tithe portion and basically play all of their spells a turn later when they always have 1 mana open for the Mana Tithe, and I'm always amused by that, especially when I don't even have Mana Tithe in my hand at the moment. And people say, well, that's just why Mana Tithe is a bad card. And I say, I'm playing a control deck, and you're going to play all of your cards a turn later. You're basically playing your deck slower, which is what I want you to do as a control player. So to me, that is a win. It's even more of a win if you're doing that when I don't have Mana Tithe in my hand. And also, if you're doing that, that means you're playing out all of your extra lands, and I plan on blowing up all your lands. So there's that. Coalition Relic. It's kind of functions the same way as it does in Cruel Ultimatum, but a little bit different. I find myself not using the charge counter on it as much. You know, maybe you can accelerate into a boom bust, or hey, we have planeswalkers down here. Or like a turn 4 Elspeth or something, that can be silly as well. But most of the time, since we have these X spells in a lot of instants, I find myself just tapping it for mana. But this is a nice non-land source of mana for after we blow up everything, and then we can still have the mana for Mana Tithe, or even post bust. You can use a charge counter on that and make 2 mana on your turn to play a Raise the Alarm. So yeah, the idea is with this deck, it kind of plays a draw-go thing with lots of instants. At the end of turn 2, you either want to fire off a Raise the Alarm or a Think Twice if there was nothing that you needed to remand. That's kind of how the deck plays. And also, something else that's really good to have out when you blow up all the lands are Planeswalkers. So we have the Elspeth Sun's Champion, Gideon Ally of Zendikar, which I have loved. This is another token-making machine. The emblem is also relevant. It's a very quick clock after you blow up all the lands. You know, a lot of decks have a hard time dealing with Planeswalkers in Modern, especially Elspeth and somewhat Gideon as well, and they have an even harder time after you blow up all of their lands. Like I said, this deck is off the wall and silly, and I also run a Narset Transcendent in here. I don't know, looking back, maybe this could be something else nowadays. I have not updated this deck since Oath of the Gatewatch. I'll get into that when I talk about the deck's matchups. But, and I'm still running a one-of on the Dictate of Heliod as kind of a throwback to the standard deck. And some people have asked me, well, why isn't this like Honor of the Pure or something? I have a couple reasons for that. I still like the flash, so it's something, you know, if you're holding on to counters like your Cryptics or your Remands, and at the end of your opponent's turn you can just drop that into play if you have it and you have the mana available. Or you can also drop it into play during combat, totally screw up your opponent's combat plans, and you can't do that with Honor of the Pure. Another thing is this Dictate is immune to Abrupt Decay, which is pretty relevant. And another fun story I have is it also does not trigger Eidolon of the Great Revels effect to deal damage to yourself because it costs 5 mana. So funny story. I'm playing against this guy that has this burn deck, and we get to a board state. He's at like 9 life. I have like 4 tokens on the field and Dictate in hand. He's tapped out and he has Eidolon on the field, and I just untap and I draw and I have the Dictate, and I'm just like, I think I just win here. I attack with everything. I don't remember if he blocks or not, but it was irrelevant either way. And then I played the Dictate and doing enough damage with my tokens to him, and the Dictate did not trigger his Eidolon. So we always joke around whenever someone else is in a conversation with him, and I'm nearby, and they're saying, "Oh, I hate your burn deck. What's it weak to?" You know, he lists all the typical things that his burn deck is weak to, and then we always throw in Dictate of Heliod. It's also weak to Dictate of Heliod because it doesn't trigger Eidolon. And so we always get a laugh out of that. So yeah, that's all of the crazy cards in the main deck. Let's go to mana base. I've got 4 basic planes, more basic planes here because, if you have a basic plane sitting there, no one's going to expect you to be able to counter their spell. They're like, oh, you just have a basic planes, I can do whatever I want. No, you can't. Mana Tithe. They probably should be a couple Flagstones of Tarkir. I don't have those. It is synergistic with the deck, but on the same sense, I've never felt too much of a need to rebuild my lands after playing a bust and destroying all lands. So it'd be good for the deck, yes. Completely necessary for if you're on a budget, probably not. Desolate Lighthouse, like I mentioned, there are cards in here that can become dead, like the Boom Bust if you commit to not playing it, or Mana Tithe, so you'll want to cycle those away and find something else. So I've got one of those in here. The rest of it is your basic, fetches, shock lands, and tons of check lands, because you guys know I love check lands. And we go to the sideboard. So before we go to the sideboard, even though you kind of caught a glimpse of it there, some matchups that this deck does struggle against. Not every deck entirely cares about all their lands being destroyed. 2 of the decks that this deck really struggles against is Affinity and Merfolk, and those are kind of the 2 main decks that hold it back, partly because Raise the Alarm isn't that impressive against them. You get tokens, which sound good against Affinity, but if they don't fly, they're not that great. And so Affinity doesn't really care about 2 1/1 ground-based tokens. And they don't really care about destroying all lands because they have cards like Springleaf Drum, they have the Mox, they have, I think it's called Mox Opal. I don't know, I'm not an Affinity player, so that's not a card I ever use, but and they also have Darksteel Citadel, which is indestructible, so they don't care too much about Bust. Also, they're going to dump their hand long before you have the mana to cast Bust. And also, going back to Merfolk, they have Aether Vials. They can just vial in all their stuff after you blow up all the lands. So Boom and Bust will get sided out against those types of decks. And those decks also typically don't care about Mana Tithe as much either. Affinity can still play their stuff and leave a mana open very easily to play around Mana Tithe. So they can play around Mana Tithe and Boom Bust simultaneously, which spells doom for this deck. And Merfolk, Mana Tithe is not impressive when your opponent has Vials out. If you can turn 1 Mana Tithe their Vial, that's amazing. But other than that, Mana Tithe, not so good in that matchup, because they have Cavern of Souls, they have Aether Vials. You don't really want to play Bust because they have those Vials, and they have the chance of recovering. And once again, Raise the Alarm, not that impressive against Merfolk either. And that's why I feel that this deck, I wouldn't consider it part of my trifecta of most successful decks. Once again, that's kind of reserved for decks where I can just grab it, they're tested, they're tuned, and I can be pretty sure that I'm going to win prizes at a local F&M that night. Not quite true with this deck, but I do feel that the success level of this deck is a bit above average. This is a deck I wouldn't mind going back to and tweaking and updating. And speaking of which, I mentioned earlier that I stopped playing this once Oath of the Gatewatch was released. That is once again because 2/1/1 tokens are not that impressive against the likes of Thought-Knot Seer and Reality Smasher. So there was that as well. So once I saw that those were coming out and the Eldrazi Aggro Menace was getting popular, I put this deck aside. And even now after Eye of Ugin is banned, I mean, those Eldrazi decks are still around. They're not as popular. They're certainly not as game-breaking as before. I would argue they've become a healthy part of the metagame instead of warping the entire metagame. But yeah, Raise the Alarm, not good against those decks either. And other cards that could go in here is like Goblin Dark Dwellers would be a good fit. maybe even Ancestral Visions, over the thing twice, I don't know. But that's another option as well. So there's other things to test out. So sideboard, even with wear and tears and such, this deck struggled against Affinity and the like. So my sort of answer to that was Electrode. Tried a couple of them out. They're a little bit slow, but if they stick, they can. If they stick and your opponent doesn't kill you next turn, they're pretty amusing. This was also really amusing against a blue-black fairy list, especially after they sided out all of their Disfigures and Smothers, because who's going to keep those in against a token deck? And then I side in Electrode, and I was just endlessly amused by that. Like I said, this deck is off the wall and fun to play. So we've got our typical 2 Dispels, 2 Relic of Progenitus, got a couple Wear and Tears, Counterflux because I like having counter spells that can't be countered. This is a card that shows up a lot in my blue-red base decks. And you still want Crumble to Dust against Tron decks, so that's in here as well. Another thing you'll notice is that sacrifice effects are absent. I believe that's where the Electrode was, or that's where sacrifice effects was in place of the Electrodes. So yeah, I'm kind of missing the sacrifice effects in the sideboard. That would be something else I would change if and when I go back to this. I'm sure I'm going to play this deck again. This deck is too fun to not try at least once more. And then I had Timely Reinforcements. I only owned one of it at the time, and so I also threw in a Pulse of the Fields. This is another card that I like to have against burn decks and some aggro decks, because you just gain 4 life and then it returns to your hand. And then you can do it again every time you need to gain 4 life. Just make sure that after you gain 4 life that you're not going to have more life than your opponent, and you get it back. So a couple other tips with playing this deck. If your opponent's not doing anything, never be afraid of firing off or Raise the Alarm. If it gets countered, whatever. If it doesn't, you get your soldiers, start attacking your opponent, especially against control players. Get in that chip damage. You might not think it's that important, but we have very little burn, only 3 lightning bolts, and 2 Secure the Waste. But I did mention that there's a lot of times where we play Boom Bust, blowing up all the lands, and we only have a few tokens on the board. So any chip damage that you can get in the early game becomes very relevant after you blow up all the lands. So keep that in mind as well. Yeah, I think I've covered everything for this crazy deck. So the next deck I'm going to look at, I've got one more deck, and it'll be kind of a quick one. It's more combo oriented, and I gave it a try once. Wasn't too thrilled with the deck, but I think I'm going to share it on this channel anyways, because this is not all about the huge successful home runs of the Shadow of Doubt and Cruel Ultimatum, or the wacky but still successful stuff like Tokens or Bust. But it's also about my journey through the modern format, different decks I've played, successes and failures, things that were average in their performance to above average and below average, and all-star decks like the Trifecta. So we've got that deck to look at, and then we'll get into the post-Oath of the Gatewatch decks. So, I'll see you all next time. This is Late Night Mega. Good night, everyone.